Hi, everybody. This is the first 30 coming to you in a strange way. It's not Instagram Live. We're talking to Cary Fagan on Zoom about his collection of short stories, Great Adventures for the Faint of Heart. This was an incredible collection. I am excited to talk to you about it, but I'm going to give my own sort of blurb about the 10 stories. Because as I started writing them down, I realized they weren't as ordinary as I thought they were when I started kind of summarizing them. This collection of 10 stories is filled with ordinary people in Canadian towns who inherit a lewd Picasso print, take a road trip from New Brunswick with their girlfriend's strange kid, a grown woman who still hangs out with her imaginary friend from childhood, family violence and grief, potato puppets, a wannabe poet and her ex-boyfriend's famous mom, never-ending garage sales and gentrified neighborhoods, a bohemian family who picks up a strange hitchhiker, estranged families and dogs in Rome, just ordinary people. And
that worked for me.
Right.
Thank you.
The most impressive thing about this collection, every single one of the stories for me, is that they exist. There's no real spectacular revelation or resolution or I mean, there's tons to take away, but there isn't really any kind of moral lesson, I guess, is the that's not really what I want to say, but they're just stories about ordinary people experiencing these moments that are kind of extraordinary in their way. When you sit down to write a story, the beginnings are so important, but so are the endings. When you think about a short story, do you think about the beginning and the end?
Good question. I do and I don't, I suppose. The thing I always start with is the voice for anything I write. And it's usually hearing a voice that makes me want to write something.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I think about the beginning of a story, more than like, oh, I have to open with something that's going to grab someone's attention, what I really want to do is establish the voice of the story that I'm hearing. I want to establish it for myself and for the reader, because I think that's just, I mean, to me, this is obvious, is that is our point of contact with anything we read. It's that voice whispering the story into our ear. And are we going to be enchanted by that voice or bored by that voice? So trying to capture that from the beginning of the story is important to me. Now, obviously, it's also important what is, excuse me, what's happening at the beginning of the story. But what I really want to try to do is let the reader know how it's going to be told, whose hands the reader is in at that moment. So that's really how I begin, was hearing that voice. Yeah.
And in the collection, is first person, third person, omniscient, cross-gender stories. How do you know when that voice comes to you that that's the story it's going to tell?
Right. It's interesting because when we were emailing, you mentioned both stories written in third person, omniscient. I thought to myself, well, how many stories are in first person and how many stories are in third person? And I didn't know. So I actually went and counted them, came up with 6 in third person and 4 in first person, which I found interesting because I used to write in the first person a lot more. Primarily, I couldn't really imagine writing a novel, for example, in the first person when I began. And I always just found it so much easier. And I think, the reason is, instantly who's telling the story. It's like a character in the story speaking in some imagined way to the listener. And I love the way that voice can, can structure and form and decide how this story is going to unfold.
Mhm.
So the first person's always felt like a very natural and a way for me to tell a story. And so I used to use it a lot more, I think. And then I just encountered stories I wanted to tell where it just didn't make sense, because I think it really happened with my second novel, which is called Sleeping Weather. And actually, my entire first draft was in the first person.
Mhm.
And I realized after I wrote that, that this character could just never tell his story, even though we have this convention, like, who is the first person narrator actually speaking to? How are they speaking to us? We
Right.
don't really ask those questions, right? We've learned to accept that relationship. But it seemed to me that this character was so buttoned up and had so many issues that he hadn't been able to deal with, that he couldn't have that confessive voice. It would be impossible for him. And therefore, I needed somebody to look over his shoulder in a way and tell the story as he experienced it without it being his own voice.
Mhm.
So I had to rewrite that story in the third person. And then that made me much more conscious that there are just some characters who really can't tell their own stories. They don't have the sort of voice that is capable of telling their own story. I think maybe it's a slightly more extroverted character that will tell their own story. Not necessarily, but sometimes. And then sometimes the circumstances don't allow it. So I began to write more in the third person. And as I continued doing that, I really fell in love with that voice and all the possibilities. Because of course, when we say first person or third person, that doesn't really tell us very much about the voice. It tells us one very basic thing, but there's a
Mhm.
million ways to have a first person or a third person voice. But I found that, having that, I don't really call it, for me, it's not really the author's voice, it's just the story's voice, allowing the story to be the voice rather
Yeah.
than the character. That became something I think that gave me a lot of more flexibility to tell some stories that I couldn't tell in the first person. And for me, that voice, although I made with that novel, I did it wrong my whole first draft. Most of the time, I instinctively know what the right voice is,
Right.
partly because it's wanting to capture the voice that makes me want to write the story in the first place. So it's not something I usually agonize over. It's generally something that comes to me quite naturally and just is there from the beginning.
Mhm. And is that because in your mind, before you sit down to write the story, that you've got a character, that you've got a situation, that you've got um, experiences that
Right.
you want that character to have or express?
Yeah, I mean, they all do come together. So definitely voice and character and come together, and usually in some kind of dilemma or situation. They all three are sort of a package,
Mhm.
but at the same time, one might precede the other two by a very short bit. For example, the story set in Rome. It's the only story not set in Canada, called The Dog of Rome.
Mhm.
I knew for a long time that I wanted to use we went, my wife Rebecca and I went to Rome once for about 3 weeks, and I made a bunch of notes, and I just really wanted to use that setting, because of
Mhm.
course I have to exploit, I don't have that exciting a life. I like to exploit what little I have. So, and I like to get out of Toronto and get out of Canada, fictionally speaking, once in a while.
Mhm.
So I knew I wanted, so that in that case, the setting um, was there before the story, but very, very quickly, I knew it was going to be about this man
Mhm.
who comes. At the same time, there were some things I didn't know, and it took me a few years to write, just actually sit down and write the story until I did know some of the other aspects of it. So sometimes it'll be, you know, a voice, or Laughing Air, which is a story set in Vancouver, a place I've never lived in, but I like the idea of writing about Vancouver. And
Mhm.
the term Laughing Air, I didn't know that term until actually it was Rebecca who told me, mentioned that term to me, and that it's somebody who inherits property from a person who's died, a relative that they didn't know or didn't know well. So they're not really emotionally upset by it. They just get this windfall without the emotion attached to it. And
Yeah.
I just thought that was that idea, you know, and maybe, and something that could potentially transform a person's life that they completely don't expect. So in that case, there was some of the narrative was first. So, but then the other things come really quickly behind, and so that it's really hard for me to separate them, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would probably say Westphalia is my favorite story.
Oh, that's
Um, I know it's funny because I think it's because that's the time that I grew up, and this idea of not having a television is familiar. But I just love that the idea of this 2 or 3 days. It's not clear if he's there for those that length of time or longer. Those 2 or 3 days leaving such a mark on these kids, on those two kids, and completely changing their lives, right? Like making it so much better. And the television, of course, making
right.
life so much better.
Right. Right. Somehow he changed their lives, but the most concrete thing he did was convince their father to buy a television,
Yeah,
which
that's
is
so
so
near
ordinary.
drawn. Yeah.
And that story is one of the most fictional stories. That family, it's about a family of kind of a bit of a hippie family, and how in a way how uncomfortable the children are living in this family, and the father's always picking up stray people and allowing them to stay at their house and
Mhm.
go on these holidays in their Westphalia, which is a little German camper van. Um, and that wasn't my life at all. My parents were, they were not like that. We were very kind of ordinary, middle class, upper middle class. My dad was a lawyer, you know, and very Jewish family. So it was not my family at all. But I also I love losing myself in an imagined life. And so sometimes I write very autobiographically. Sometimes, quite often, I'll take some little thing that's autobiographical and I will expand it into a fictional world. That's the
Mhm.
most common thing that I do. And sometimes I'll do something that's really nothing like at all like, and that story would be one. There's somebody owns a Westphalia van in my neighborhood. I don't
Oh,
know. It's always parked somewhere. It's very beat up. They don't make them anymore, I don't think. They're just they're always old when you see them. And I've never done that. I just love the idea of sort of having a camper van and just, you know, living out of it and crossing the country. That just sounds like, you know,
yeah.
sounds like freedom. So,
I
but at
think
this,
about that all the time, except the nighttime thing. Like I would be the person who parked the Westphalia van in a very bright Walmart parking lot somewhere.
yeah, for sure, for sure. But and I do think it's, you know, I mean, it's particularly the dog. It's the story. That's a first person story told by the son who's now grown
Mhm.
up, but his older sister is the one who really hates this life that their parents have imposed on them. And I think I found that really interesting. A life which, you know, which on in one way sounds really great because they've got these very free and easy parents who care about other people and don't really care about money and are not into
Mhm.
mass culture and stuff. And yet how, you know, naturally how desperately children want to fit in. I've certainly heard, I had a TV growing up, but I
Mhm.
know people who didn't. And one of the things they often say is how they out of it they felt at school because everybody would be talking about oh, did you see Laugh-In last night? And they have no idea what they're talking about. And it was very embarrassing to them. And they really, they'd go over to friends' houses and sneak, and all they wanted to do was watch TV at their friends'
Mhm.
houses. They never got to. So just imagining what this experience is like. And then this young man, this rather wistful, odd bass playing
Double
double
bass.
double bass playing young man, who hitchhikes carrying a double bass. I don't know, but
Right.
and how he somehow shakes things up a little bit for them, and how fond they become of him. It's just and one of the things that also happens is, of course, when you start a story, it does, of course, take on a life of its own. And I don't know, I may have a sense of what the ending is, but it doesn't at all mean that's where the ending will go. And one of the
Mhm.
things I love about stories is you can feel, you're only writing 20 or 30 pages. You don't have to be afraid that you're going to get lost in the middle if you don't work out what the whole narrative is.
Right.
And you can, I mean, and I have a strong idea for a story, maybe a few scenes, and I will sit down and start to write it without really knowing where it will go. And it just kind of does take over. I mean, it's not, it's nothing mystical about it, but you allow you allow your imagination to just bring to life this story for you. It's one of the, I mean, that's the thing I love the most about writing, and why I continue to write, is
Mhm.
just to be lost in that experience. And so you don't know where it will go. And I didn't know where that story would go.
Mhm. And what about the magical elements, like the imaginary bear and the strange girl that the kid may or may not be the Civil War photograph and the girl that
Oh, right. Well, I guess I think of them slightly different. Right. The bear is I guess because in one of your emails you said magic, and I was thinking, okay,
Mhm.
what's magical in them? And I didn't think of that. But yeah, Bear Stories is about this young woman who's done her PhD and is looking for a teaching job now. And she wrote her thesis on bears in children's literature. And hasn't never told anyone the fact that when she was a child, she had this imaginary bear friend, very big bear, who was completely real to her.
Mhm.
And now, in this sort of moment of crisis in her adult life, the bear returns to her. But I guess for me, I don't have to really answer the question. I mean, why is she seeing the bear again? Like, why is this how is it possible an adult can have this childhood imaginary experience? It felt that it was possible to me. It
Mhm.
felt real. you know is uh is is there something wrong with her? Does she know that this is in a way, this is just an imaginative fantasy that she's allowing herself to have? That's certainly possible. So in that, but that for sure is the one. And she, of course, writing about children's literature, I think, is still naturally more connected to her child self than a lot of people are, especially a lot of people that age who are trying to be adults, working at
Mhm.
adults. So as far as the story, Photographs of the Civil War, which is about a man who takes his girlfriend's young son, picks him up right in
New Brunswick.
Brunswick, and drives him back to Toronto. And the boy tells him this, I think, slightly disturbing story
Mhm.
about a relationship he has with a little girl, a girl who's much younger than him, even his neighbor. And he points to a picture, which is a picture of in a book of Civil War photographs, and it's a girl from the Civil War who's been blinded, and he says, that's the girl, that's the girl next door. um I don't think it's so, I guess I didn't read it magically myself, probably so much as him, either the kid either the girl in the picture really looks like his next door neighbor, or, I think kids' minds are always looking for connections
Mhm.
all the time. They're always trying to make sense of what they see based on what they know of the world so far. And so they'll, um, um, I remember my mom telling me one day when I was a kid that she was going to Holt Renfrew, which was a woman's store,
Yeah.
fashion store. And I always thought she said, I'm going to hold and rent fruit. And because I didn't know what the words meant, I had to make them mean something.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so, and I think kids do that. They look at something and they try, well, where can I find what this means? And that's why they get things sometimes very, very wrong. And so I think that might be happening to him. But I think it's also because the boy wants this book of his photographs,
Mhm.
and the man allows him to buy this book. Some of the photographs are of Civil War dead, and some of
Yeah.
them of people who have been mutilated. And of course, when the kid's mother on the phone hears about it, she's pretty unhappy that he let him have this, but and he didn't really know why. And the reason, in a way, the reason is both simpler than he imagines. It's not about the Civil War at all. It's not about war. It's just about this photograph, and
Mhm.
also more complicated than he imagines. Because again, what does this photograph mean to him?
Yeah.
Why does he think this? So I think one of the things about that is there's some mystery there, which is not fully explained. I hope it's satisfying without necessarily being explained. And I think that's something that I have tried to bring into my work more as I get older, which is the mystery of life, which there is, and how much we never really understand, and how much we guess at, but we're not sure about. And um, I think that's why there's ambiguity in the stories, not because it's cool to be ambiguous and not give answers, but because we don't have the answers to
Mhm.
everything.
Yeah.
How can fiction provide those answers? I mean, um, fiction has to, provides hopefully a shapely and beautiful form for life that for its image of life that we can, like appreciate artistically, and also provides certain satisfactions, which I think what I want to do is give satisfaction in fiction that maybe we don't get in life, but that doesn't lie about life.
Mhm.
And so you can't tell everything, because you can't know everything.
Yeah, I think that's why I love the short story so much, and have loved it um, since I was very young, because I feel like I can live in the moment with the characters, live in the days, the weeks, or even years, but so much of their lives, or so much of what's happening, exists outside of that story, outside of the pages. And so I love that as a reader, I get to imagine what might happen next, or I get to imagine what might have happened before. And that's I think the power of the short story form.
I agree with you, and I'm someone who loves to leave things out. So even my novels, maybe my early ones, I've never written a long novel. My earlier ones were longer, but now my novels are maybe 200 pages or
Mhm.
that. And sometimes people say, oh, that they want more, but I love to leave out what I can and put in just what I think needs to be there. And I love to leave a lot of room for the reader. You sound like
Mhm.
ideal reader, because you like
I
that
love
room.
it.
Yeah. And not have to have everything explained, or not have to have all the backstory,
Mhm.
um, but just be, willing to accept that you're not going to know everything, but what you are going to know is going to be hopefully very present and very vivid and engrossing, I hope.
Yeah. Lenny, the story with Lenny, the punch, was so great for that, because just at the very end, and what is revealed at the very end, as a reader, you immediately go back to all of the decisions that Lenny has made, all of the reasons he's doing what he's doing, and why he ends up doing and saying, or saying and doing what he does. I love that. I love that in that phone call at the very end, I'm left as a reader imagining his entire life almost.
Right, right. And I think, yeah, because that's a story about a confrontation between two cousins, which ends up in a criminal charge. And I do think that we so often do not understand what's happening in another person's life.
Mm-hmm.
I often think that when I see somebody, like a stranger on the street, who's very angry,
Mm-hmm.
um, or who gets very angry at me, or I've thought about, I'm not someone who deals with anger very well. I get angry sometimes, and I don't know how to use anger very well. Like, I don't know how to use anger effectively. I end up basically shooting myself in the foot somehow when I'm angry. And and I know even from myself that that moment comes from tremendous frustration that may have nothing to do with the circumstances, etc. That
Mm-hmm.
we're such complicated, emotionally complicated animals. Yeah, the punch was the most painful story to write, for sure. I found that a rather painful story to write.
Yeah, it was. It was, I mean, the grief at the end, but also just full of complicated people, the entire family, really. But yeah, I've got it. Susan is asking a question. I hope that's okay. Do you
Yeah,
think much about audience as you're writing? And if so, in a general way or in a more specific way? In other words, does it affect your writing of a particular story? And if so, how?
I think I always think about audience. That's Susan Hughes, right? My fellow children's author. So, and I mentioned that, Susan, because I do think I think about it a little differently for kids' books and adult books. I am always aware, I like to describe it. I have two eyes, one's looking in, one's looking out at the same time. So I'm thinking of how my words will affect the reader, what they'll get from it, what I'm, the degree that how much I'm revealing, how much I'm not, whether or not my opening will interest them to want to read the rest of the story. I am thinking of the reader at the same time. But I think I always have, because I started writing very young. So that idea of, you know, finding the voice of the story and at the same time being aware that voice needs to speak to somebody is something that is developed so, together, so much together, that I don't really separate them. It is a little different from writing for kids, because I think I realize I am much more aware of my kid audience. You have to be aware of, if you're writing for a certain age, for example, what sort of, like emotional sophistication you can expect, maybe, even though all kids, of course, are different, but you want to bring to them things that they can really think about, even difficult things, but that they're able to process. You don't want to bring things to kids that would be, too painful for them to process at this point in their lives, for example. But I don't have to think about that obviously for adults. And so I definitely can write maybe with a little more assumption that what interests me will also interest my reader, hopefully.
And has there ever been a time when you've had a story idea or, just a thought or situation that you imagined would be in a kid's story, but ended up needing an adult story, or vice versa?
Yes, absolutely. And I'm looking over to my shelf. God knows if it's there or not. I've got a copy somewhere. Yes, I have a kid's picture book called Thing Thing, which is about a stuffed animal that gets thrown out of the window, a high window of a hotel by a spoiled boy, and it falls, and you get to hear what Thing Thing is thinking, and Thing Thing is also looking through all the windows that it passes, and you get to see all these little scenes of what's happening in all these rooms as Thing Thing goes down, and you don't know what's going to happen to poor Thing Thing. I thought that was going to be it's hard to believe, but I was sure it was an adult story. I had this idea for an adult story about a couple who have a fight, and they have, I can't remember, they have this, they own a tortoise, this like 80-year-old tortoise, and one of them, either on purpose or accidentally, actually tosses this poor animal
Oh my
out the
gosh.
window. That was my thought for an adult book. And I don't do it so much anymore, but I used to always take my story ideas and put them on file cards. And I still do to some degree, and I have a little recipe box. And it was in there for, I'd say 10, 20 years before I finally looked at it and said, that's not an adult story, that's a kid story.
Mhm.
And on the other hand, I have a novel called A Bird's Eye for adults, which I actually do have right here.
Mhm.
That's how big this novel is. It's a little guy called
Nice.
A Bird's Eye, and it had a scene in it of a train crash. And in that train crash, a lion escapes from the train. The trains run along the lake, so of the city, and this lion escapes and runs up into Hyde Park, which goes down to the train tracks.
Mhm.
And that was part of this slightly fantastical novel. And I took that scene out. I decided it was too much. My reader wasn't going to go along with me here.
Right.
But I really liked that scene. And I, at some point, thought, one of the reasons that scene doesn't work is it's in the middle of the book, but I could start a book with that as a kind of premise, and then you have to believe it to read the rest of the book. And so I wrote a book for kids called The Hollow Under the Tree, about a girl who discovers there's a lion that is living in Hyde Park in Toronto in the 1920s.
Nice.
And so I basically just took that scene and used it to start my kid novel. So there's obviously a lot of, I do think there are differences in my kid and adult work, but there's a lot of correspondence and interest too. And definitely I've learned a lot from writing for kids that I think I've incorporated into my adult work, and vice versa. Yeah.
So last question. I'm a huge fan of William Trevor, and this book felt very William Trevor-ish to me. And I don't know if that's because I've been reading really, really different short stories than William Trevor, but this felt a lot like him. So who would you say is and I aspire to be even an eighth as talented as he is, but who would you say is your inspiration for writing short stories? Not kids' books and novels so much, but who are your favorite short story writers?
Well, I started writing short stories when I was like 12 or something. And then I got serious about it when I was about 16, which only shows you that I am in no way a prodigy, because I didn't have my first books published till I was in my early 30s. So I'm slowly there, actually. And at that point, I had a couple anthologies. My dad gave me a great anthology that he bought when he went on some work trip. And so I had read Chekhov and, Scott Fitzgerald and Hemingway pretty early, like not when I was 12, but when I was more like 16, I had read some of those, and because those were the people who were in those anthologies. And then later I started discovering people, and one of the couple of people were Norman Levine, the Canadian writer, who became a friend of mine, who was wrote such exquisite short stories and became important to me, both for how he wrote, but also my deciding that I love the way he wrote, but I also wanted to do some things that he didn't allow himself to do. So sometimes people are helpful for you to, judge how you want to be different as well. Mavis Gallant, who also was, and then certainly, like, I don't think I write like Chekhov, but I mean, I think isn't it a lot. When I read interviews, I'd say 75% of writers say that their favorite author is Chekhov, and that would probably be true for me as well. And his stories were extraordinarily important to me. But I'd like to say I write like Chekhov, but I don't think it's true. And there's that really realistic side, but there's also a side that likes to be more playful and a little more fantastic. And some of that comes from my very early love of Dickens, who is more obvious an influence in some of my kids' books, but I think is also an influence. Or Annie Proulx is someone who's very, writes some, I love her short stories, and some of them are pretty wild. It's funny, I was reading William Trevor, his collection a bit on the side recently. So I don't really, and I'm not sure that I think if we have something in common, it's we do write about, or him even more so than me, about ordinary situations and ordinary people. And I think that's why this title, Great Adventures for the Faint of Heart, which is a kind of a line from one of the stories. It's not the name of one of the stories, and I'd not done that before, but I feel that ordinary life is a great adventure. So, like, I have been told that even as a praise, that my work is, quietly dramatic, not, it's not grippingly dramatic. And I think it's really dramatic. I think it's much more dramatic than that. I think having to decide, I don't know. I was going to try to pick a particular story, but anyway, I just think that these things to me are great adventures and mean a great deal to us. So they don't really seem like small things to me.
Yeah.
So I don't feel that, I need, just exaggerate, I don't need car chases and gunplay to make it exciting. I mean, that story comes from Stinky, the title comes from Stinky Potato Golem, which is a story about a brother and sister who grow up to become, had to have a puppet theater, and how his ambition in his life is just to walk from town to town, putting puppet shows on in neighborhood parks, and he doesn't even have the courage to do that. So to me, that is the, I guess it says something about me, but it's, I just went to Kingston for a couple of days on my own, just because I was tired. I need to get out of Toronto. When I came back, Rebecca said to me, that really was a great adventure for the faint of heart. This was my great adventure, was going to Kingston. And what did I do when I was there? I sat in cafes and I wrote, basically. But I had a lovely time. I really enjoyed myself.
Nice.
So
well, there is tons of drama. I mean, the yard sale story is, I mean, neighbor drama is sometimes deadly. So within the yard sale story, there is certainly drama.
Right. Yeah, no, I think I like story. I mean, when I first started writing, I guess I thought it wasn't, sophisticated to care about a really good narrative that makes you actually want to find out what happens next. And as I got older, I realized this is ridiculous. I love reading books like that. And every time I pick up a book where nothing happens, I have a really hard time getting through it. Just face the fact that you like narrative, you like a story that makes you want to get to the end. Yeah. And even though my characters might not be leading superhero lives, I really want my reader to want to know what's going to happen to them and what decisions they will make and what surprises will happen to them. So I want them to be readable stories, embraceable stories. That's because it's the kind of writing that I came to realize that I love to read too.
Yes, they were for me. Great Adventures for the Faint of Heart is a fantastic collection of short stories. This will be a read again collection for me. And I'm not a read again kind of person. I don't know why, but this will definitely be a read again. Thank you so much for sitting down and talking to me about this book.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time. I appreciate it.
Of course. And you can find out more about Cary on his website, caryfagan.com. And you can buy Great Adventures for the Faint of Heart directly from Freehand Books, which is freehand-books.com. Again, Cary, thank you so much. Have a great day.
My great pleasure. Cheers.
Take care. Bye.